Welcome back, MTG Joe here. Today we are going to be looking at the weekly metagame breakdown for the highest win rate standard best of 3 decks on the MTG Arena ladder. If you're looking for best of 1 standard, we did it a couple days ago. You can find it in the playlist as well. But today we're going to be focusing on best 3 this upcoming weekend. This is being recorded on Sunday, but Saturday coming up in like 6 days will be the Qualifier Weekend. So there's the best of 3 play-in on Friday, the actual Qualifier Weekend on Saturday for Standard. So time to lock in that deck if you are competing in the event. So we're going to get the data from UntapedGG for this one. Later in the week, we will look at what's happening on the MTGO side, see what's happening in the tournament space to kind of give us a full range of ideas. There's one deck I am going to include at the end that's been showing up more on the MTGO side. It's a unique deck, so I wanted to kind of highlight it as well. But data from UntapedGG, if you want to track your win rates, get some standard stats, link is in the video description to get started with them. I'll paste and timestamp all these deck lists so you can lift and copy paste to your heart's content. So starting off, let's look at popularity of the day. So Esper Bounce, we see it coming in at about 15, just a shade under 15%. We have 4-color domain at 14.1. So those are kind of your two most played. Mono red not too far behind at 11.3. Then we have a little bit of a drop off. We have Dimir Midrange at about 8%. The Omni deck at 7.5. Azorius Control at 7. The Oculus deck at 6. And Gruul Prowess at 4. The Oculus deck has actually come down quite a bit in terms of win rate. We'll still cover a version, but it wasn't as high as it was for some of the past weeks. So looking at the stats, we got 32,000 games from Diamond and Mythic played from March 9th through today the 16th. Jumping into it, Esper Bounce, highest win rate deck. So there's some configuration differences between some of the lists. This version here, a lot of them are playing some number of stock ups. They moved off the Optimistic Scavenger. This one is opting to go with 2 entity trackers, as well as 1 Destroy Evil in the main. There's also 1 to 2 Overlord of the Bale Mercs, which we'll also see play in some of these decks. But for this deck is to kind of rebuy and replay powerful enchantments. Hopeless Nightmare drains and it eats away at their opponent's hand. Storm Chaser can be your win condition with tokens that you can then rebuy with this town, so it gives you that value. Then you can buy back this town, so it's just a loop in that case there. Kaido, very strong card to kind of cheat into play as well. We have a bunch of cheap removal, Momentum Breaker, Nowhere to Run. I'll let you rebuy and have more removal options. They draw cards off like Entity Tracker, and then you can pick up cards with Fear of Isolation and Nurturing Pixie. In terms of the sideboard, Break the Spell, destroying target enchantment for 1 mana. So this is just helpful against like Domain, 1 mana, blow up any other enchantments. Dream of Steel and Oil, good against Lord of the Ground decks, think like Duress. It's actually reasonable against Domain because it hits Zur and the Overlords. If you run into the odd, Domain or Affinity style deck, it's also really good in those matchups there. Goes Vacuum for Graveyard Hate, Grim Bauble for more cheap removal against like Mono Red or Lord of the Ground aggro decks, Destroy Evil for bigger things and enchantments, Rest in Peace for Graveyard Hate, Preacher when you just want to shift to a little bit more of the mid-range when like the bounce plan's not as good. Similar with Shieldred, also reasonable just to like block better against like mono red, stuff like that. And then Temporary Lockdown as a sweeper for the more aggressive decks. Also plays nicely because you can rebuy a bunch of your smaller ETB style decks. Moving on, mono red aggro 70%. So a lot of the lists are now adopting some number of Soulstone Sanctuary in the main board. They are going up to 22 lands. Some lists are playing some Sunspine Links main. This one's opting for 4 in the side. That's kind of the flex spots. Otherwise, it's a pretty stock list, all things considered. Mouse Package, Nemesis on the top end, your various kind of creatures and pump effects. Lithomantic Barrage, blue and white things, Beza, Overlords, stuff like that. Oculus, Torch the Tower for smaller things. You have Pyroclasm in here for the go wide decks. A lot of times, like with Prowess, this can scale out as well. When you're shifting a little bit bigger, it can be a reasonable approach. Sunspine is really good against Golgari, Dimir, Domain, basically things with a lot of non-basics. You just punish them, and it gets around things like Temporary Lockdown, shuts off the life gain without having to do the like ping your own nemesis kind of approach. And then one more Witchstalker Frenzy in the side. I don't hate Obliterating Bolts. Some of the lists also will run some number of Ghost Vacuums if you want to try to hate on the Omni deck that way. The problem is they usually will have Temporary Lockdown, which deals with your Ghost Vacuum that way there. Moving on, we go to Selesnya Cage, 69%. So this one here, it's like a Cookies sub-theme. Built around Bright Glass Gear Hulk, 4 mana, 4/4, first strike trample. It enters the battlefield. You search for up to 2 artifacts, creatures, enchantments with mana value 1 or less. So you can have like a toolbox style effect. Dusk Rose is removal, Haywire Might, artifact enchantment hate. Lava Spur Boots gives your creature haste and ward. So nice for like the subsequent copies. Haste out any of your threats. Novice Inspector can be card advantage. Wormlet scales and gets bigger, can gain you life. Warden of the Inner Sky as well, that gets bigger with the Convoke effect. Regal Bunnycorn, Tough Cookie, a bunch of ways to make cheap artifacts or tokens that you can animate. Then you have Steel Seraph that can give your Regal Bunnycorn flying, for example. And then Sentinel plays nicely, doesn't die to a lot of the common removal in terms of nowhere to run, and then makes a bunch of map tokens that can grow your creatures, but then also play with the other artifact sub-theme of the deck. Graveyard Hate, Artifact Enchantment Hate, Artifact Enchantment Hate, again, Artifact Enchantment Hate, just different types. These can be tutored, for example. This one deals with flyers as well. Graveyard Hate and Rest in Peace. The nice thing is with the Gear Hulk, it can also pick up Ghost Vacuum. Sheltered is mainly in here for the aggressive decks, like Mono Red, Gruul, stuff like that. Removal, you can generally make fairly large creatures and then kind of give it lifelink. Haven Interrupters for the sweeper decks. Try to catch them there, buy you an extra turn, and then split up for kind of the creature mirrors, offense, defense. There's a ways with like the tap effects, you can tap your creatures to get around the various split up effects, and then Obstin's Bailoff for the heavy discard decks. Even against the aggressive decks, you might consider it for the life gain. We then have Zur Overlords, so green-white based deck that is using the off-color lands for domain. This lets you animate your enchantments with Zur. Big card in the deck, obviously, up the beanstalk, lets you draw cards off any of the impending overlords. Ride's End being 2 mana, that draws you a card. Your Leyline Binding being 1 mana, drawing you a card type effect. Get Lost, Temporary Lockdown. Analyze the Pollen here. Early game helps you hit lands. Late game, you can collect evidence and go find your Zur or whatever is most relevant. Elspeth Smite, cheap removal, negates for the mirrors, big mana decks, stuff like that. Graveyard Hate, Terra Sunder, flexible removal. Stone Brain basically says go find Jace or any sort of mill style effect, try to remove it that way there. Stock Up for the grindier matchups, Obstin's Bailoff for the heavy discard. Elish Norn's good in the mirror, anything with a lot of ETB style effects. Atraxa, kind of the grindier matchups, just refills your hand. And then this is really good in the mirror, mono white control, anything with like a lot of enchantments. That. We then go to Azorius Omni combo, 67%. So this deck here is looking to self-mill, draw discard, you put Omniscience into the graveyard, you then cast Abuela's Awakening, you get it into play, you cast Invasion of Arcavios, Invasion then goes to your sideboard, gets Season of Weaving. Seasons of Weaving will then bounce, create a copy of Omniscience that becomes a token, and then bounce the board. That lets you cast the Invasion again. You can keep casting like this over and over if you want, but basically you'd go into your sideboard, get a Nerving Grasp, keep kind of milling till you find the second copy of Invasion. Each time you basically return this back to hand to rebuy the spell. Once you have the second Invasion of Arcavios, you can this town ain't big enough, pick up both copies, get Heroic Reinforcement, and just keep repeatedly casting it over and over, make an army, kill your opponent. You can also go Haunt the Network, Breach the Multiverse. There's a lot of different ways to kind of play your win condition in that regard. And then in the sideboard, you have Exercise, deals with a whole bunch of hate pieces, Get Lost is cheap removal, Grand Abolisher, stops any sort of counterspell, instant speed decks. Sometimes you'll see the blue-white Gear Hulk in the sideboard as well. So that's one that comes in to kind of another way to get rid of Graveyard Hate. Negates for cheap counters, Temporary Lockdown for the aggressive decks, Day of Judgment. So main board in this configuration is pretty much all in combo. And then the sideboard, you have a little bit more interaction. Some of the versions have played a little bit more interaction main, temporary lockdown main, for example, to just buy you some extra turns. Azorius Control, a lot of similar cards to the Omni combo in the sense of lockdown, stock up, but this version here, more traditional control, cheap counters in the main, get Lost as removal, Ride's End as removal, Day of Judgment, Sunfall, so 7 sweepers main, Beza is a win condition, Overlord of the Mistmoors, and Jace to mill out your opponent. Fountain Ports, like a bunch of utility lands in the mana base. This one here, Authority for the aggressive decks. You have Destroy Evil, enchantments are big things, Devout Decree, black or red permanents, Exile's also relevant against like Heartfire Hero. You have Negate, just cheap counters, Rest in Peace for graveyard decks. River Churn Monument plays nicely against like the Mirror or Domain, anything with like slower matchups, you can just mill them. Tishana's for anything activated ability, Jace for matchups where they're kind of grindier and the mill makes more sense, Wilt Leaf for the heavy discard decks, Hopeless Nightmare, Dissection Tools for the more aggressive decks, just the life gain to make Fountain Port tokens to re-equip it, and then Overlord of the Flood Pits for the grindier matchups. We then have Dimir Midrange. So this one's at 67. So this is not the bounce version, just kind of mid-range good stuff. Flood Pits Drowner, Fairy Mastermind, Deep Cavern Bat as cheap hand hate. You have your Enduring Curiosity that'll draw you cards. Kaido can be cycled or ninja'd in and you get like really strong value on curve. Mainboard Tishana for activated abilities. You got a sweeper, a whole bunch of cheap removal mixed in. A Shelly main. Soulstone Sanctuary also plays with like the ninja theme with Kaido as well. Sideboard gives you a lot of flexible options. Hand hate, Duress. Ghost Vacuum for graveyard decks, Spell Pierce for cheap counters. Fairy Mastermind plays really nicely into like Beans. Anointed Affliction, Exile, cheap based removal. Negate is cheap counters. Edict for bigger things, hitting like your opponent's Kaidos. Baybloom Trick, if something's like all in, you can tap down. Also plays really nicely in the Mirror because a lot of these creatures are X1s. Preacher of the Schism for the grindier matchups. Tishana for Domain, anything heavy activated abilities. Urtai, Counterspell, as well as counter target abilities, and it's a threat. Gig's Command as a sweeper. Then have Gruul Delirium, 62%. So this one's a little interesting, seeing some copies of Thunderous Velocipede. This doesn't actually play with any synergy of the deck in terms of the creatures. None of the creatures come in with counters. So whenever each other vehicle or creature you control enters with an additional 1/1 counter on it, but it doesn't come in by base with the counters. Counters get put on your creatures after with things like Breakout or Paw Patch, but they don't enter. So it's basically just a trample vehicle that could come in. The Wren helps you self-mill, pull out the stuff. The plus works nicely with Restless Ridgeline because you get the ability. And then this version here, on the Violent Urge, just pump up your team, give a big double striker with trample, things like Wildfire. The Velocipede plays nicely with Violent Urge. Keen-Eyed Curator can also become very large in this deck, but you're trying to set up Delirium by getting 4 permanent types and then just pushing out huge amounts of damage. Anchorbloom main for some hate pieces. Breakout lets you cheat out creatures with haste, plays really nicely with fear of missing out. Sideboard, just a bunch of cheap removal, another Cankerbloom for artifact enchantment hate. You can also play, for example, Haywire Mites. That was something I was playing just because it's 2 types. That plays nicely. You have Obliterating Bolt for cheap removal, Paw Patch for like Domain, Pyroclasm for the go wide creature decks. You have Outpace Oblivion. So basically, think of it as Witchstalker Frenzy. That's an enchantment, which plays nice. You have the Sunspine Link or Screaming Nemesis for the red matchups, Sunspine Links for the Domain, kind of greedier mana-based decks. You then have Gruul Prowess. So this is the mouse version of the deck. There's a lot of flex spots with these decks. This version, for example, is full Forge Tower, 1 Burst Lightning. There's been other versions that play the inverse. Personally, I'm a fan of the inverse just because Burst Lightning, being able to go face, has a little bit more utility. You typically don't have a lot to bargain in this deck, So they basically both do 2 damage, having the flexibility to go. Obliterating Bolt main. Your mouse package in Keeper's Talent lets you repeatedly trigger Valiant, get card advantage for, say, Emberheart Challenger, make very large creatures, plays very nicely with Manifold Mouse. Questing Druid's main, you'll sometimes see anywhere between 1 to 4 main versus sideboard. Another deck that is incorporating a couple copies of Soulstone Sanctuary inside. Barrage, blue or white permanents, Beza's, Oculus basically. Obliterating Bolt, another permanent here, or like 4 damage, creatures, stuff like that. Paw Patch versus Domain, grind your matchups, you have Questing Druid. Red matchups, you have Screaming Nemesis. You have the Sentinel of the Nameless City. This one here is going to be for like your bounce decks, things that are doing like 3 damage. Links for the aggressive, or like Domain, stuff like that. Frenzy for bigger mana. In my version, I'm playing like full 4 links in the side, full 4 Paw Patch formation as an example, but kind of it's basically what you anticipate in the meta game, and then kind of build it around with that. There's the Gruul Leyline version, or basically Gruul Leyline, mono red Leyline, Leyline of Resonance, a whole bunch of pump spells. So this version's on the not the full mouse package, Slick Shot instead, just because it works better. You have Turn Inside Out, Snakeskin Veil. You'll sometimes see Overprotect as another option. Snakeskin Veil oftentimes will still have your creature die to Nowhere to Run, where Overprotect, the +4, oftentimes will protect your creature. But if you're really good at this deck, you're always going to have Leyline on 1. There's turn 2 kills with this deck through Cacophony Scamp or Heartfire Hero, basically double pump effect, or fling it at your opponent with extra damage. You have Burst Lightning for just cheap removal. Dreadmire's Ire can deal with, it's another pump effect, gives trample, but also can deal with artifacts. Graveyard Hate, big things. Manifold Mouse lets you scale and play a little bit more like just traditional mouse. You'll sometimes see even in Keeper's Talent when you want to just board out of the Leyline if your opponent's going to overboard on removal. Paw Patch, Enchantment Hate, Flyer Hate, and then Questing Druid for the grindier matchups. We have Jeskai Oculus. So this one here is at 54%. So these decks have kind of a couple different versions. This one is got the Monument to Endurance. There's some ones that are basically Boros just with blue for Oculus. This one is kind of a mashup of that. You have Guardian of New Benalia, discarding cards at whim that trigger the Monument of Endurance. Bunch of draw discard style effects that work nicely with Prof's Eidetic Memory, making very large creatures, or like putting a bunch of counters on a creature, especially with like Vigilance is nice. Cheap interaction, Bounce Off, Spell Pierce, Torch Tower, Scorching Dragonfire, all exile based removal, and then you can bring your creatures back with Recommission or Helping Hand. Discard them, bring them back, get value out of it. Sideboard, Abrade deals with Ghost Vacuum, stuff like that, and also removal. Get Lost, cheap removal. You have No More Lies as cheap counters. Brotherhood's End can be a sweeper for your opponent's board, but also deal with a lot of their artifact hate. Kasua's Flanker, Graveyard Hate, you can flash in and rebuy. Lauren, Artifact Enchantment Hate. Screaming Nemesis for the red-based matchups. Chandra and Ral for they bring in Rest in Peace, stuff like that. You can bring these in instead. You could also look at like Exercise, but you have Lauren that does a better job with that. So 2 other decks. I've been watching a lot of another streamer, Flesh-Eating Gnome, on Twitch. They've been playing variations of Dimir Demons. This particular list, that they've been fine-tuning it. They have a couple different versions, but they've been like towards the top of the ladder. So like up in the 200s, kind of messing around with stuff. This deck here, pretty well positioned in the metagame right now. If you're seeing a lot of Domain and like Pixie, stuff like that. Doomsday basically leaves all but the bottom 6 cards of your library. If you have a Jace out, you just mill them and win, or you untap with Restless Reef, attack them in, and then you basically break parity, and they have a 1 card draw left, and they lose the game. Otherwise, it's a Dimir control deck. A lot of cheap removal options, cheap counters, change the equation, Nowhere to Run, Maze Mind Tome for card advantage, Stock Up helps you find the combo. Version's also playing 4 Oil Deep Gear Hulks. Lets you either attack your opponent's hand or curate your hand by forcing a discard and a redraw. Lifelink here as well as Ward, so helps stabilize you into the combo. Hand Hate for the kind of control-ish mirrors, Ghost Vacuum for Graveyard Hate, Negate for cheap counters. The mid-rangey control decks, you have Outrageous Robbery to steal their stuff, Malicious Eclipse for the aggressive decks. Creature helps you stabilize against the aggressively to mid-range decks. Also lets you shift up and puts more pressure when some of the matchups, like say against Azorius, you might not want cut downs or stuff like that. Dashana's for activated abilities, Phyrexian Obliterator for any of the red-based aggro decks, and then the End as just a general steal their best thing, and then Surgical Extract it from the library. The last deck, and I apologize for the ad on the site, but this is a black-white Ketramose control deck. This one went 5-0 by Combo Man, so full 4 copies of Ketramose. You have Beza, a Shieldred, Maze Mind's Tome for card advantage, Parting Gust Exiles, and can draw you cards with it. Cease Desist is Graveyard Hate, but also the latter side, the Desist part, can deal with all the enchantments that are like Domain. The End Exiles, Anoint Exiles, Cut Down. Soul Search is basically kind of like a Thoughtseize effect that exiles. That would draw you a card off Ketramose. Deadly Cover Up exiles cards from your graveyard and then from your opponents. So this would trigger Ketramose. Legion to Ashes exiles. Really good against any of the offspring effects. Manifold Mouse, because they have the same name. Nowhere to Run, Temp Lockdown. But you basically went through your Restless Fortresses, your Bezos or Ketramose or Shieldred in this deck. Ancient Vendetta is basically Stone Brain, but without the kind of setup turn. Ghost Vacuum for Graveyard Hate, Exercise Artifact Enchantment Hate or Big Things, another Beza for the aggressive decks, Pest Control for the aggressive decks, Aya for the grindier mid-rangey style matchups, Dreams of Steel and Oil, Reasonable Against Domain, stuff like that. Urza Silex as another Edict style effect that exiles, so you draw a card. So when it's put into exile from the battlefield, you can pay, but otherwise destroy all other permanents, activate only as a sorcery. So it's kind of got some setup. It can, in the grindier matchups as well, can take out some lands. It's an interesting one here. You can also just play like Day of Judgment because your Ketramose sticks around anyways. Because like 2 turns, it kind of telegraphs a sweeper as well, so your opponent may play around it. Cut downs and duresses for a hand. That's it for the week. Let me know what you've been playing, what you've been liking, and what you're planning on taking to the event. Personally, I went 4-2 in the play-in. I'll try again next week probably in best of 3. I'm going to run Gruul Aggro myself. Just the deck I own in paper, the deck I enjoy. But catch you next time. Thanks for watching. Stay safe out there.